Dr. Elder, what's going on, man? Welcome to the Dad Edge, my friend.
Hey, thanks so much. I'm happy to be here.
Happy to have you. I am so curious, man. Um, your expertise in PTSD and the study that you've done and what even got you involved in this? Like, what got you interested in this, even this field?
You know, in my 20s, I was married to someone who had PTSD related to some childhood abuse, and I naively thought it would be, a couple of tearful talks, and we would be able to work through it together. And I don't think that I really understood um, how much it would affect the relationship. And so the first thing I noticed was this difficulty with anger, and noticing that arguments would escalate really quickly. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to help. And so um, I wanted to pursue training in trauma therapy. I did an internship and a postdoc in trauma psychology. Um, I went to therapy with my spouse. We did weekly treatment for 4 years, and nothing really got better. And I thought there's got to be a better way to do this. There've got to be treatments available that create change, real lasting change, more quickly than 4 years. Um, the marriage eventually ended, but I had the opportunity to start a group for couples at the VA where one or both of the partners had been diagnosed with PTSD. And um, we found that in 2 months of weekly sessions, uh, couples really improved the satisfaction of their relationship and decreased their symptoms. Um, so that was sort of how I began. I was really motivated to have had, to get the treatment I wish I would have had.
And what was your PTSD caused from, if you don't mind me asking?
No, you're fine. I actually don't have PTSD myself. I was married to someone who had
Oh,
PTSD related to childhood abuse. Um,
okay, okay.
so,
Just out of curiosity, so I have two questions for you about this. So you and I were talking before we hit record today, and I was telling you about my, experience with PTSD back in 2017 with a horrible, 33 days of sleep issues that I just could not fall asleep, and it turned into just absolute chaos for me. And up until then, because I was diagnosed with PTSD after that, but up until that point, I only thought that PTSD really was for first responders or for someone who's in the military or like, a kid who is like, tragically like molested and raped by, a trusted relative or something like that. And they just couldn't shake it, right? I never thought that PTSD could be other things. And like, even when I was going through counseling to kind of get over that hump of that horrific 33 days of really not being able to sleep more than an hour and a half, 3 hours a night. I did not even like when the counselor was like, "You have PTSD," and I looked at him, I was like, "What? Like, how do I have PTSD from that?" Like, but I knew I did. It was a horrible, stressful situation. And he looked at me and smiled. He goes, "You'd be surprised." He's like, "Divorce can give someone PTSD. Like the things that you don't think could do." So I think that there's this huge gap of what people really understand, like what it actually is. I'm guessing there might be certain degrees of it, but people could have it, maybe not know it, and it just shows up in a certain way. So if you could define what PTSD actually is, and then if you could maybe just basic signs and symptoms that might illuminate that.
absolutely, yeah. So, about 75% of Americans at some point will have a traumatic event occur to them that could turn into PTSD. Um, but only about 8% of people, 8% of men, and 20% of women go on to develop PTSD. And let's talk a little bit about what a traumatic event is. There is this perception that PTSD is only related to combat trauma. And
Right.
you know, most media representations of PTSD are people who come back from deployment and they're having nightmares and they have drinking problems and anger. And we've known for thousands of years people come back from war different.
Sure.
PTSD has been known as soldier's heart during the Civil War, or shell shock, or during World War II, combat neurosis in in World War II, or battle fatigue if you were, uh, you know, a leader in the military and you were given some time off. Um, but really, the number one event that leads to a diagnosis of PTSD is sexual assault. There's something about the closer you are to the violence that leads to more severe symptoms. But let's talk a little bit about some of those events. Those could be physical violence. It could be a natural disaster, a medical disaster, or being, close to death, fear that you're about to die, or seeing someone else almost die, hearing the details of someone that you love having gone through a terrible event, hearing the details of somebody else and seeing kind of being exposed to those graphic details, seeing the site or pictures or hearing about how something happened, um, watching video footage as part of your job of a horrible event. Um, if you fly drones for the military and you've seen um, casualties take place, or other horrific events, you can be diagnosed with PTSD. So really, it's about believing that your life is in danger and threatened, and that loss of control, feeling like, you know, the resources you have are, not sufficient to keep you protected from the threat you're facing.
It's interesting because like even as you say like all those things, right? Like I'm sitting there thinking like it's almost like who hasn't been exposed to some of those things or all of those things to a minute degree or something that's like full blown,
Right.
right? That's absolutely uh, just right in your face or right in front of you, or actually just happens to you, right? Uh, what are some signs that you're with a partner, like you specifically you were married to someone who had it? What were some of the signs and symptoms that emerged when you guys were together that basically showed this?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So, there are four primary symptoms of PTSD,
Okay.
and PTSD didn't become a diagnosis till 1980, which is,
Really?
fairly
I didn't know that.
recent in psychological science. It wasn't until that point that, in many returning soldiers from Vietnam, we sort of saw that there are these symptoms that hang together. The first one is re-experiencing, or having thoughts pop to mind, little videos that play, or photographs, stills of the event. And when those occur, you also have this physiological reaction inside of you. You start to feel hot or sweaty. You feel tightness in your chest or throat. You feel shaky. You go into sort of a low grade fight, flight, or freeze. Um, so that's re experiencing. Avoidance. Avoidance of internal things like thoughts or feelings related to the trauma event, but also avoidance of external things. So places, people, conversations, events, things that remind you of that traumatic event. So, not going into crowds, or avoiding fireworks on the 4th of July, or conversations or social interactions. Um, the third symptom is hypervigilance, feeling on edge all the time. Feeling like on a scale of 0 to 10, you're always like at a 7. Makes it hard to fall asleep, makes it hard to concentrate. Um, it it can make it difficult to manage anger, make you easily startled or spooked. And then finally, negative thoughts and emotions since it happened. And those thoughts usually revolve around 6 primary areas: thoughts about shame and guilt, thoughts about safety, about trusting people and yourself, power and control issues, self esteem, or the way you feel about other people, and intimacy, closeness with others. Um, so, if you're noticing, for example, that your spouse tends to jump to self-blame really quickly, if you're noticing that when your person feels threatened, they're quick to anger, if they're having frequent difficulties with nightmares, of course, that's sort of a stereotype. But one of the most prolific researchers in PTSD, Candace Monson, calls PTSD fear of emotion. And it's this really kind of perpetual avoidance of discussing one's own internal feelings, to the point that sometimes people become out of touch with what they're feeling. They rely on their partner to help them express their emotion and to help them manage their emotion in a way that's really overwhelming for a partner. I mean, it's hard enough, sometimes being in a successful relationship and managing conflict that's typical for a relationship. But when you become kind of the person who manages someone else's emotions, it can feel really overwhelming. Some of these symptoms happen right away. Some of them, and it would be normal for some people, for 30 days or so to feel those symptoms after a difficult event like a car accident or having been to the emergency room. But if those symptoms have lasted longer than 3 months, it's become a mental health problem that should be treated. Um, and so, this became a diagnosis, but it wasn't until really the 90s that we understood why some people develop PTSD and why others don't. Why so few people who experience a traumatic event go on to have these symptoms for longer than 90 days. And the number one reason is avoidance. Avoidance is really the reason that PTSD stays on its tracks. And there are some interesting researchers like David Barlow who really call avoidance the villain of every mental health story, which I think makes sense. In depression, it's avoidance of hope and disappointment. And in anxiety, it's the avoidance of feeling out of control of your future and not knowing what's going to happen. In PTSD, it's avoidance of anything that reminds you of the trauma. And so breaking down avoidance is really the heart of all mental health treatment. Learning to tolerate distress, learning to regulate emotion, learning to do the things that you've been avoiding doing that are reasonably safe, so that you build your confidence that you can handle those situations and the thing that you're afraid of happening doesn't happen.
Wow. Can I ask you a personal question?
Yeah, for sure.
So this whole sleep thing, I think a lot of the audience, if the audience is not new to this show, they probably kind of know that story of like back in 2017, I was training for this ultra event with Mark Devine's Kokoro Challenge, the 50-hour hell week that I was going to do. And I had trained for like a year, and I was training really intense, really irresponsibly. And basically I just fried probably my central nervous system, my adrenal system, just exhausted myself to no end. And just literally just completely hijacked my sleep. It was almost like my body couldn't calm down. And, I was only sleeping an hour and a half, 3 hours a night for 33 straight days. And then I ended up in the hospital for 4 days. And I remember the worst part about the situation, to be honest, was night. Was like literally like trying to think myself into sleep and trying just being desperate to go to sleep. And like the even the physical feeling of, I felt physically ill. Like I was nauseous, exhausted. I couldn't think right. It was one of the most horrific experiences that lasted over a month of my life. And here I am 7 years later. And on nights, like last night, I just had a hard time getting to sleep. And it had nothing more to do with the fact that we had sloppy joes for dinner, and my stomach was like an absolute wreck. Like my stomach was so upset, and I couldn't relax because my stomach was just killing me. But I still, on nights that I can't calm down, and it probably happens 1 to 3 times a month, where I have a harder time getting some nights it takes me less than 30 seconds to fall asleep.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that's the majority of the time. And then other times, like, I just can't get in that mode. But what I notice is it's like a switch flips, and it's the fear of the thing coming back, or like I start to have thoughts that are similar to when I was going through that time of like almost like I remember like what the room looks like at night, or like I look over to my right and I know what the windows look like, and I would stare at those windows for hours. And it's almost like I joke with my wife, it's like when I have nights like that, I say, yeah, the demons came out last night, and it's still to this day, 7 years later, like it's almost a decade later. And there's a part of me that, even though I've been through counseling and I've gotten through it, and I've never had anything even remotely close to that happening again, but still, like, there's that tiny, tiny lingering thing in my mind that, what if this happens again? Or it's like the similar feelings or even the similar things that I see in the room come back. And it's like a trigger. I can't explain it any other than that. I'm sure you can. But the triggering effect, it's almost like I go into almost a different state. Maybe it's like the fight or flight state in a way, that I'm just like, I'm more on edge. And when I get even more on edge, it's harder for me to even sleep because I'm thinking about it. I'm sure that makes total sense to you.
It does, yeah. Our brains are designed not to make us happy, but to help us survive. And you had this dramatic moment of learning, and your body said, we're never going to let this happen to him again. We're going to learn all of the triggers that remind us of this horrific event, and we're going to sound the alarm. We're going to have his amygdala fire and release cortisol to quicken his heart rate so he can run or fight or freeze so that he can stay alive. And so your body has made this overgeneralization to anything that reminds you of that event. Stomach discomfort, difficulty sleeping, you feel like you're about to lose control again, and you won't be able to protect yourself. You might also find that you have some difficulty sometime in other situations where you don't feel in control of your body. Maybe times when you're sick, or maybe when you feel chronic pain, or maybe in times when you feel like you're not sure what's about to happen. You might, and there are things that you can learn to do. One thing that you, I'm sure, are doing is talking to yourself and really looking at probability. How many times has this happened to me? What's the likelihood that it's going to happen again? It's actually probably very low. But when our emotions, when our physical sensations are really intense, it makes it feel like they're telling you something important that is true. If I had to sort of boil down what I do as a therapist into one sort of brief thing, I'd say it's teaching people how to respond to their emotions more effectively and their body sensations, knowing what's an adaptive and functional response. So in this case, imagining that something terrible is about to happen is something that is going to happen, it's going to occur to you. You obviously can't change that, or you would, but your response can change. You can be accepting of it and say something like, it's understandable that I would have this feeling as a result of being reminded of that experience, but I'm not in any real danger. This feeling typically goes away within about 20 to 30 minutes. My strong emotions are probably leading me to feel like this is a real danger and threat, but I don't have any real evidence that that's the case. I felt this way probably hundreds of times before, and nothing terrible happens. And I can wait this out.
Mm-hmm. Can I?
Yeah.
Can we switch gears just for a second? Because I want to just make sure that we're talking more about the audience than I am about me. I was curious, and I appreciate you answering that, because I think that gave clarity to what is happening to the body and the mind when someone's going through something like that. How many people would you say, just men in general, and let's just talk about dads, husbands, fathers, um, dads, husbands, fathers, men, husbands, and fathers. How many men do you think are walking the earth and have a traumatic event that they maybe, quite frankly, aren't even aware of, that they're probably dealing with, that it's probably spilling over into their marriage or into their fathering, um, and or we're married to someone who has gone through a traumatic event and they haven't necessarily dealt with it, but we're seeing those signs and symptoms. Like, do we know stats on that?
Yeah. I mean, so approximately 1 in 5 women and approximately 1 in 10 men.
Wow.
And that's just, you know, I think that the numbers are so much higher for women, not only because women face sexual assault at much higher rates, but also because women are more comfortable seeking help. The number is likely higher in my estimation for men, but men so rarely report. And also, men demonstrate some different symptoms of mental health issues that sometimes fly under the radar. Anger, for
Mm,
example,
yeah.
is sort of seen as just a dude problem or a dude
Right.
thing, but also can really mask depression. Hyperactivity, restlessness and being, having a hard time focusing can actually be anxiety. Um, and not wanting to talk about your feelings, being hyper self reliant. Being hyper self reliant is something that I've only more recently become attuned to. In the in the psychology of men and masculinity research, emotional expressiveness has been really seen as the big deal. Obviously talking about your thoughts and feelings has been a highly studied
It's
topic
tough.
for men, and it is hard, and most, a lot of men say that they have a hard time talking about emotions. And if you're in mental health and you're trying to figure out how to improve men's lives, figuring out how to get men to talk about their feelings seems like something you really mostly want to study in order to help men improve their relationships. But more PTSD related research in recent years is showing that another masculinity trait may be a bigger problem. Um, and although self reliance in a moderate dosage can be really helpful to resilience, seeing yourself as capable of making good choices, in bigger doses, this kind of hyper independence can be a real barrier to connecting, and perhaps a bigger problem than inexpressiveness. We all know guys who will talk about their feelings sometimes, uh, but it's about how you talk about your feelings. If you're willing to connect, if you're willing to seek help, um, that seems to be the difficulty that gets in the way of recovery and keeps men stuck in trauma symptoms, but also other mental health issues. Um,
Can I ask you about that?
yeah, please. I appreciate your natural
Yeah.
curiosity. I think it's part of what makes your podcast so successful. You're
Well,
just a person studying all, you've got a natural curiosity that, curiosity can't be taught. It's just innate, and you have it.
oh, I appreciate that. Yeah, it's funny. Like, ever since I was a kid, my mom always called me the curiosity kid. Like, I was always asking questions. I was always just so curious about things in general. I've never been able to figure this out. And I'll just give you some super authentic raw context, right? So I'm a coach for men. I have been for almost a decade. My job is to bring these things out, right, in men, and to encourage them to bring these things out, and to make the environment so welcoming that they want to. And because I know the benefits of that, especially when a guy is able to sort of meet himself, right? And then understand what he's feeling, what he's going through, and then to have the solutions to move forward. The interesting thing though is this, what I have found, and I think if you look at the Dad Edge brand, what we do in the Alliance and that kind of thing, it is not this airy fairy fluffy estrogenic type of feel that I think a lot of guys sort of, if you look at this like in a fishbowl, right? Like this whole like sharing of feelings things among men, like and I was actually I went out with it's kind of funny. I went out with one of my son's teachers who I'm actually friends with, and we went out last Friday, and we were just catching up, you know, shooting the shit, and then we were actually at his microbrew together and just hanging out. And then two guys, older men, came in. They were in their 50s, and they were having a meeting with him about like using his microbrew for like one of their events. So they sat down and they saw my Jeep in the parking lot, which had the Dad Edge on it. And it was funny, they didn't know I was the Dad Edge guy, and we were sitting there talking, and they're like, "Whose Jeep is that out there?" And I was like, "That's my Jeep." And they're like, "The Dad Edge? What's the Dad Edge?" And then I explained to them what it is. And they were just like dudes talking about their feelings. And I just kind of smiled, and I'm sitting there thinking like, well, they don't know how we talk about their feelings. And so then I was like, how long y'all been married? And I'm going to give you like how we do this. I'm like, how long y'all been married? And one guy was like, man, I've been married he's like, I got married a little later in life. He's like, I've been married for 7 years. He's like, man, my wife, like, she's the best. Like, she's my best friend. And I was like, what makes your relationship like that? Like, what do you guys do? And I'm talking to you like I was talking to him. He's like, oh man. He's like, we just do a lot of things together. Like, she's my best friend. We hike together. We work out together. We go to wineries together. We talk together. It's like, we raise our dogs together, and you can see like the excitement in this guy's eyes, right? And I was just like, if you were to give advice to one of your kids about marriage, what would you say? And he's like, marry your best friend, you know, communicate, talk about everything. And I just sat there and I just smiled, and then I go, do you feel like this is a weird thing? Like, you're talking about things like this? He's like, no. I was like, this is the biggest misunderstanding. And the one guy, but I didn't say this before, the one guy before that guy said that, he goes, I don't talk about this stuff because I just don't talk about it. And then as soon as his buddy was talking about it, I was like, do you feel weird talking about this? He's like, no, man, this is cool. I was like, this is how we talk about it. It's like this. It's not like, oh, tell me about your feelings and tell me about your marriage and are you talking? And like, and the guy was like, no, man, this is cool. And I was like, if you set the right environment for men to talk about their feelings where it feels cool, it feels masculine, like, man, let me tell you like the good things we're doing. I'm also going to tell you about the things we struggle with too, because I want to talk about that too. But we talk about it in this way that just feels right. But I think what men do, me included, I do this stuff too, man. It's like, if I'm going through a bad moment or a bad day and my wife is like, hey, you doing okay? Yep, I'm fine. Like, and I'm sitting there thinking like, you ain't fine. Like, and she's just wanting to, like, I know in my head, cerebrally, like, I know she's like, I just want to connect with you. I know you're not fine. I'm not going to think you're weak because you had a bad day. I just want to know what's going on. And if you tell me you're fine and you tell me you're good, I feel like I'm disconnected from you. Like, I know that's what's going on. But yet in my dumb male brain, that's the answer I should give, because I want to avoid telling her that I don't have a handle on something, because what if she thinks I'm weak? Right? And for some reason, I've been doing this for a decade, yet I still fall into that bear trap. And I see so many men fall into that bear trap too. And to be honest, like, I'm telling you this as a guy who coaches at this, but I'm also telling you a guy who struggles with this. I don't know sometimes the best way to get out of my own way. Like, how do we do that?
It's a great question. You know, and the longer I've been a psychologist, the more I realize I know so little about my own emotions. You know, I used to think, oh man, I'm interested in psychology. I know how I feel. I know what I want. I don't know how I feel. I don't know what I want a lot of the time.
Thank God,
you know,
man.
and sometimes I fall into the trap that you described, in part because I don't know how I feel. And I'm not used.
That makes sense.
I'm not used to like asking myself what's going on with me. I'm working. You know, I'm
right.
But but I'm willing to say I don't know how I feel exactly. I need a second. And then I come back. And I also notice that there are times when I'm less likely to talk about my feelings, and I give myself a little compassion for those times. First 30 minutes after I come home from work. Thursday nights, because I'm exhausted and I still have Friday to go. Man, I am a bear. I am not somebody you want to be around. And so I say, let me think about this for a second, and I'll tell you. But you're right. It's interesting. Both men and women both rate emotional closeness as very important to relationship satisfaction, equally important. And yet, we do have this model that women want it more and that men want sex more.
Sure.
But men and women both want to be emotionally close. And if men, most of my patients, if I say, when are the times you've felt closest to your partner? It's no mystery. It's times you've talked the most. If you want to create closeness, talk. You can get men to talk, though, by doing activities. What I liked about your friend's
100%.
Recounting why his marriage is so great. If you can get a man to do something with you, often then he'll start talking to you. And then he's like knee deep in telling you what's really going on with him, and he doesn't quite realize that it's happening and why he's enjoying it so much. This is actually why I'm so passionate about studying masculinity and relationships, because what brings greater joy in life than connection? And also, the things that we're taught men should do keep us from that connection. So every man who makes a relationship successful is expanding his notion of what manhood can be. Every man who's trying to make his marriage work or be close to his kids is going to have to break in some ways from those norms or what we think that men should be. And so it is tricky to be a man and to learn how to be happy and to be mentally healthy and to enjoy those relationships. It's also tricky to be somebody who helps men. It's a specialty all its own. You got to learn how to appreciate storytelling and to not challenge men until roughly the third time you meet with them, because the first two times they're going to be pretty suspicious of you. So don't be worried about that. Something happens on the third hour you spend with a man. He starts to laugh. You should, consider laughter a success. He'll start telling you about himself. Trust actually develops. Men are so rewarding to work with. You kind of feel like Indiana Jones. You're like exploring some part of them no one's ever been in before, not even them. And you get to be there as they find words for the first time for things that they're experiencing.
Question for you about just couples in general. So the difference, you alluded to this a little earlier, and I just want to get some clarity from you. I've heard this a couple of times. Men want to connect through sex, right? Usually, right? We want to connect through something physical. Women connect through something emotional. So this is the analogy I've heard. Most men want action, and then comes the connection, meaning like the physical thing of sex, and then we feel connected. So when we feel disconnected, we automatically usually want to go have sex because it's like, so if I feel disconnected from my wife, Jess, it's like I have this intuition that I want to have sex with her, and I want to have sex with her, not because like the physical release of it. I want to have sex with her. I mean, that's a great bonus. Don't get me wrong. But I also want to I want to feel close to her. And sometimes, and from a guy's point of view, like that's a good way for me to feel close to her. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, the women need the emotional and then the action. So it's like you almost kind of have like this yin and yang of like, well, I need this first to feel this then first. Well, I need this first to feel this first. And is this why like maybe men and women sort of bump heads when it comes to this? Because we used to run, my wife and I now know this. I know for a fact my wife needs to feel emotionally connected to me in order for us to have sex. Like, it's just better for her that way. But in our early days of being married, like, we would be completely disconnected. And then I'd go and try to pursue having sex with her, and she's like, you haven't even talked to me all day. Right? And then it would fall flat. So is that usually the case with, as far as like this yin and yang of needs with men and women?
That's a great question. Maybe the question, right? When it comes to men and women in relationships, and men and men in relationships, and women in relationships. One primary difference is that men and women have different arousal patterns, right? So men have the desire to have sex, and then they want it and they have it. And women often start to feel emotional closeness, and then they may start to have sex or feel physically close and then want to have sex. And so that's I think part of it is just different arousal patterns. I also think that having our muscles contract and then relax completely during sex does make you more mellow and feel less guarded. And so after sex, you're like, oh, now I'll talk about my feelings. Because I'm like, because I'm chill. It's sort of like how you feel after like a couple drinks or,
Yeah.
but also I think men fear disclosure and the vulnerability of talking about their feelings.
1000%.
And so the closest thing to intimacy, if you're not going to talk, is sex.
Yep.
And so sex is a way of getting the closeness that you want without having to risk emotional vulnerability. And I think with time, many men start to confuse sex and emotional closeness. They start to go, oh, I want to feel close. And they don't think talk, they think sex. And making a good relationship works also involves developing, sensualities during sex, emotional closeness, eye contact, making love, which sounds so dumb when you're younger. But as you get older, you see, the best sex that you have actually does create this sense of incredible commitment and adoration and desire to protect and guard and make your own this person, which is different than hooking up,
Yeah.
So I think it's complex.
I agree. And I think I just had an idea that kind of it kind of jumped in my head. I think a lot of guys in their single life can really attest to this one. Like, I mean, we all went to college. Like, I had this friend of mine. Like, this guy was just a male whore. He was just the biggest slut. Like, he slept, I am not kidding, with over 100 women in college. And he was like kind of like the envy of our friend group. We're like, dude, like, do you ever not get action? Like, he had the most one night stands of anybody, but he would complain about it. And he would just not in the way that like the sex was bad, but he was just like, yeah, like whatever. Like, it's just like, walk of shame the next day and all this other stuff. But like, we just all got together with him not too terribly long ago, and we were busting his chops about that. And he actually opened up about that. He's like, and he's married now and like everything's good. He's like, I finally understand why one night stands didn't do it for me. And we're like, oh, really? The one night stand king? Like, so what was it? And he's like, to be honest, like, I always wanted to sleep with somebody because, to be honest, like, I wanted to connect with them. He's like, but in college, like, I was so guarded and I never let anybody in. I always thought sex was the way that I was going to feel connected to somebody. And it never happened. In fact, like, it was always the next conquest, the next chase, the next one night stand. I thought it'd be different, and I was always disappointed that it wasn't. He's like, but back then, I never understood why I was disappointed. And in fact, in my college brain head, I was trying to convince myself that that was cool and that's what I wanted, which all the while it's actually not what I wanted. I really just wanted a deep relationship with somebody, and I always thought sex was the first step to do it. So we were all like laughing our tails off hearing that story. We're like, oh my gosh, man, like you had to run through like over 100 women to get that one. Like it was just so funny. But I think it's like one of those reasons like why, men just in general, we, in a relationship, that's what we want. But I think the again, the physical release and the physical aspects of it, yeah, it's great. It's awesome. It's a bonus. But at the same time, like I've worked with tons of dudes, in their marriages over the years, and I know you probably have too. And I think if you get to the heart of the guy, it's not the physical aspect of sex. It's actually like, I want to feel really damn close to my wife. Like, I want to feel like her man. I want to feel connected, like we're friends, like all these things that we're quite frankly, we're just not talking about. I appreciate you sharing what you did. I do want to get to just one more thing before we head out of here, because I know one of the things that you're really, really good at is conversational excellence, connection, listening. And I know for you, you have a couple of things here. So like paraphrasing and listening, I actually, right before we did this podcast today, I spoke at my kids' school. And I had the guys, it was all these dads. It was like about 50 dads and their kids, and I had them go through questions. So like one of the questions was, hey, tell me about the best part of your day. Tell me about the best part of your day yesterday, or something like that. And I asked, one of the dads, hey, what did your son or daughter say? And one guy said, he said this. And I was like, well, and then what did he say after that? He goes, I actually stopped listening. And we all started laughing. But I think we're all really guilty of that. Like when someone's talking, especially when it comes into like fix it mode, right? We want to solve someone's problems, or we want to take pain away, or that kind of thing. We almost like, I don't want to say we stop listening, but we tone the listening way down, and we're not truly listening. But what is a way we can, number one, make sure that we're listening, right? For us and for them, but also let the other person know, I'm hearing every word that you're saying.
Thanks for just validating that you've heard somebody can be the intervention that a marriage needs. How often have you felt upset and then had somebody make eye contact with you and accurately repeat back what you said? It takes the wind out of your sails. You were super pissed, and then suddenly you're like, yeah, that's it. That's how I feel. And it sounds oversimplified to just listen. But seriously, I mean, communication problems are the single most reported difficulty in couples. And improving communication is the single best strategy for improving relationship satisfaction. And what's the first step in communicating? Listening. And so it's difficult to respond effectively if you haven't listened and you haven't figured out, what you've received as a message. So, paraphrasing, we've all heard it. You're just two parts of a conversation taking turns, making statements, and then summarizing back or paraphrasing those statements. So one member of the couple makes a statement, then the other person paraphrases the statement, and then the person who originally spoke gets to confirm that that's what was said or clarifies the information, and then they switch turns. So you said that you went this morning to your child's school. You were talking to men. You were asking them questions. One of the questions that you asked was about whether or not men hear their kids when they respond to their questions. Men said that sometimes they hear part of the message, but then they stop listening. Mm-hmm. That's a paraphrase. And then I say to you, Larry, is that what you said? And then Larry, you say, you missed this one part. You also missed that I said this. Or you say, yeah, that's what I said. And then it's my turn to tell you how I feel. And understanding information doesn't mean agreement. It just means you've understood. And even if you mess up, it gives you the opportunity to restate yourself until your partner understands. It's going to make you take shorter turns communicating. You got to talk in paragraphs instead of huge long pages. It's going to slow things down in a way that might feel really frustrating, but you're not going to lose your temper, and you'll stay on top of your emotions, and you'll be less likely to say things and do things you regret later. So, practicing listening and stating back what you hear can
Yeah.
be an incredibly simple step, and just validating that you've heard tends to make problems much smaller.
I think you said something really key there that I think everybody really needs to hear again. So I've heard this quote: validation and empathy does not necessarily mean agreement. It could, but it also doesn't have to. So like, if you come home and your wife is just completely frustrated and upset over, the spilled milk that happened earlier that morning, and maybe the medical bill that came in the mail, and she's just really wanting to pull her hair out. Like if you just say, "Oh man, that would be that is absolutely frustrating," or "that would be overwhelming," or "that's infuriating," even though in my mind, like I might be like, if it was me, it probably wouldn't be that big of a deal. But that doesn't matter. What matters is being able to empathize with someone, validate someone's emotional state, even if it's something that we don't necessarily agree with. And I think just human beings in general, whether you're a man or a woman, sometimes we can tamper these feelings down, right? So like I'm kind of throwing my wife under the bus a little bit, and I've done this too, by the way. But like last night, my son was my 8-year-old was super upset. He had a long day at school. He was bad day at school with one of his friends, and he was just in a bad headspace. And it was his turn to do dishes. My little 8-year-old, right? And he had a sink full of dishes to do, and he was like so upset about it. And my wife was like, "Colton, it's not that big of a deal. It's just the dishes. It's your turn." And you could just see he was just like. So I kind of went up next to him, like, "Buddy," I was like, when you have a bad day and you have to come home and you got to do stuff you don't want to do, man, it's frustrating. It makes you angry, doesn't it? And he's like, "Yeah, it does." And you could just see like, right? Now, I didn't agree with him getting all upset, but I could also understand, like, I've had days like that too. And the last thing I want to do is somebody's dishes. But I think like meeting people where they're at and validating those feelings, whether you agree with them or not, is something that it's connecting, right? Connecting. And when people feel seen like that, is there a difference? The other thing I've struggled with too, if you validate someone's emotional state, is there a fine line between enabling or not? You know what I mean? Like, or coddling, you know what I mean?
First of all, I want to say seeing our son's emotions is going to help us raise sons who feel comfortable showing their emotions. And when you feel less shame, you're much less likely to do all kinds of jacked up shit that you do when you don't feel like you can talk about your feelings, like check out for days playing video games or gambling or substance use. I'm really grateful that you allowed your son to experience negative emotion, and that you didn't brush it under the rug or tell him to man up or make him feel ashamed. You just said, "I see you. I see that you're feeling this way. It's understandable that you'd feel this way. That emotion's going to pass, though, and this is something that I want you to learn how to do. So I'll stand here with you while you do this thing that makes you unhappy, but that I want you to know how to do. I love you, even though you're feeling this negative emotion." That was some brilliant parenting. Um, Validating people doesn't mean agreeing with them. And I don't think that telling people that you understand their point of view is going to necessarily create more negative behavior. it's more likely to reduce negative behavior. Um, I think that uh, people tend to get. I remember the first couples session that I ever did as a trainee, and I went into my supervisor and I said, this woman just seems to get louder and louder in session, and she just seems to repeat the same things over and over. And my supervisor said, she's going to do that until she feels heard. She's saying, I don't think you understand this, and no one is understanding what I'm saying. So she suggested, my supervisor, that I paraphrase and that she would get quieter and she'd stop repeating herself. And so I practiced doing that in session. And I asked her husband to practice doing it in session. And she did stop repeating herself and speaking so loudly. When we feel seen and understood, we really de-escalate and are much more willing to compromise and reach a conclusion. It's only when things aren't emotionally processed and understood that these big problems seem to be so loud and persist.
So cool, man. This has been so informative. I really appreciate your insights on this. I want to make sure as we wrap up here is, how do you best help people? So as someone is listening to this show right now and they're like, man, this is really speaking to me. Maybe I want to explore PTSD. I want to explore trauma. I want to explore something, you know, or how you help people best. Number one, what exactly do you do with people that is your superpower? And then how can people best connect with you?
I'm a therapist. I'm a psychologist. I work with men primarily, men with trauma, men with anxiety-related issues. I have a website, which is sugarvalleytherapy.com. And if you're interested in learning more about trauma, the National Center for PTSD, which is ptsd.va.gov, is a fantastic resource for understanding PTSD, understanding PTSD treatment, getting help, tips for families and friends, videos about what to anticipate if you get into therapy as a man, what treatment options are available. There's like a decision aid where you can look at different treatments and choose one that you think is going to be the best match for you. I think that, the desire to change is a fantastic thing. There's nothing more unique and special than a person who wants to have something different in their lives.
Sure.
And I think my superpower is helping men to connect to people and to themselves, and to learn how to tolerate difficult emotions and know that they can handle them and have the lives that they want to have and the connections they want to have.
Awesome, man. Well, guys, not to worry. We're going to have all the links in the show notes for you. All you have to do is head on over to thedadedge.com/Friday155 for this show if you want to connect with Dr. William Elder. This was awesome. Truly enjoyed talking to you and all your expertise and just some of the amazing strategies you've given us and the clarity too. The clarity you've given us too, like around even our own emotional states and the thoughts and the emotions that bounce around in our head and especially like the like the avoidance thing. Like I find myself of like if I'm dealing with something emotionally, sometimes I'll be like, oh, I'm just gonna go work out, or I'm going to go do this busy thing, or I'm going to go work on this next thing, you know, just whatever to think about it. But no, I appreciate you coming on and sharing your knowledge with us.
Anytime. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I appreciate what you're doing. This is a fantastic show. It's a really unique forum.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's done for a lot of selflessness, you know, to help others. And it's also done for some selfishness because I need this help too. So this was awesome, man. Like I said, guys, head on over to thedadedge.com/Friday155 for this show and go out, live legendary.